Please give a warm NTC welcome to Randy Brecker.
All right. Thanks. Well, hopefully it's going to be a lot of questions. I could give you my kind of standard, I'll kind of speed through it. How about that? Usually I start with, how I started to play, where I'm from, talk a little bit about what I practice, and play a little. So you want to start with that? We're all trumpet players, right? Okay. Well, that's unusual. So let's start from the beginning. I was born in Philadelphia. My father was a semi-professional pianist. We had music around the house whenever he was home. A lot of live jam sessions. So I just grew up with all this stuff from my earliest recollections. As soon as he got home from work, he'd put on records, and on weekends, guys came over and played. And Philadelphia was a great place to grow up in back then. Still a lot of great musicians coming out of there. But when I was growing up, people like Red Rodney were playing around town. Great trumpet player. Heath Brothers, Coltrane was around. People took music really seriously. Dizzy Gillespie lived in Philly quite a few years. It was just a great jazz town. There was a lot of different influences. A real melting pot. It was kind of the birthplace of Hammond B3 organ with Jimmy Smith and a host of others that kind of followed in his footsteps when he switched from piano to B3. This great guy named Billy Root who helped get me started when I was still in high school. Kind of grew up with the great saxophonist Lou Tabakin, who was 2 or 3 years older than I, but we started playing together when I was about 15. Let's see, it was the birthplace of American Bandstand. I don't know if you remember that show. It eventually moved to California with Dick Clark, became really big, but that was born in Philly. It was the birthplace in Philly, and they had live music on the show. A lot of R&B groups. Of course, was the Philadelphia Orchestra. Clifford Brown, I have to mention him, was from Wilmington and was playing regularly in Philly with Max Roach. That was kind of their home base, and my father would talk. I was too young to go then, but he was really the talk of the town. And Dad had all of his records, and he was constantly on the lips of everyone. So when I was, I was probably about 5 or 6, and Dad was listening to one of his records. I never forgot this. It was a ballad. We'll talk about it later. And he grabbed me and said, "Randy, trumpet's the greatest jazz instrument." So I took that to heart, and when I was 8 years old, I was a pretty hip 8-year-old. We had music class once a week, and each week somebody was picked to bring in their favorite record, and this was during the Elvis days and the birth of rock and roll, mid-50s, early 50s really. And I remember as an 8-year-old I brought in John Hendricks, the great singer singing Cloudburst from Lambert Hendricks and Ross. So even at that age, I'm telling you, I just grew up with this stuff. Probably should play better than I do considering that. But when I was 8 years old, this little school in suburban Philly only had trumpets or clarinets, so I grabbed the trumpet and started to study with a teacher from the Philadelphia Orchestra. His name was Sigmund Herring. Didn't know much about jazz. He tried to help me. We'll talk about that too. But he was a very good teacher for beginners. Still has a lot of books out that intermediate kind of classical exercise that I still practice. But it was when I was about 10 years old, I got the brilliant idea for a 10-year-old. This was way before play-along records. My father was given for his 40th birthday, his first hi-fi, and shows you how old I am. This is when LPs started first coming out in the early 50s, first 10-inch LPs and then 12-inch LPs. I had a brilliant idea when I was about 10 years old to take some of his records up to my room. This was in 1954, 1955, and play along with records. And really, basically, in a nutshell, since this is basically a talk about jazz, that's how I learned how to play. I was very lucky in that respect. Plus, I had my dad to help teach me songs live. So we learned one of the first tunes was Lullaby at Birdland, Our Love Is Here to Stay, Standards. And he would coach me to keep the melody in the back of my head and play around the melody. And I started with ballads with the records. The first 3 records were, this is probably 1955, Miles Davis, Roundabout Midnight, Chet Baker, My Funny Valentine, with Jerry Mulligan. It was a record called, by Shorty Rogers, called Martians Come Back. That he was a wonderful flugelhornist, and incidentally, it was probably the first record my brother played along with, who came along 3 years later and didn't want to be stuck playing the same instruments. They only had trumpets or clarinets still at the school. Imagine what a music program, 2 instruments. So as he put it, he kind of got stuck with the clarinet. That he studied assiduously with Leon Lester from the Philadelphia Orchestra and got a really good background. I think that really helped his technique when he eventually switched to alto in 9th grade and then tenor in 10th grade. He always just had a lot of facility on the horn. Never took to the clarinet, though. In fact, I'm digressing. We played a gig in Missoula, Montana, years later with the great Buddy DeFranco, and this was a facetious comment, but Buddy was wailing away, one of the great clarinetists of all times, and it's the Buddy DeFranco Jazz Festival, playing great. So this was a facetious comment, but Buddy was wailing away, and Mike whispered in my ear, "You know, I still hate the clarinet." So just a little side thing, but we're very proud of what Mike accomplished. Anyway, so I'm like 10 years old, I'm listening to records a lot. And what I kind of happened upon, also by listening to Clifford Brown, I think it was a tune called Ghost of a Chance. This phrase caught my ear. Just that sound of the him repeating the note, and I started playing with, like I said, with ballads. Then I moved on to kind of faster tunes, and just copying what the trumpet players did. And what I was kind of unconsciously learning how to do was doodle tongue, before it was called anything. And it all came from that Clifford thing. I remember Mr. Herring at one point brought a book home called Sketch Orcs, Jazz Solos by Bugs Bauer. It was a tune called the Swingin' Shepherd Blues in there, and Mr. Herring demonstrated, he started talking about syncopation and how jazz is syncopated, and he played the tune Swingin' Shepherd Blues, which was in the book, and it sounded like. So I knew immediately to disregard everything he said. So number one, he was playing everything dotted. It was written in the book like that, dotted 8th, 16th. What I was also doing by playing with the records was to realize that 8th notes were really the way in bebop tradition, quarter note, 8th note with the 3 over it, quarter note, 8th note with the 3 over it, triplets. So rather than it would sound like, and I'm doodle tonguing, so I had to experiment. I didn't have a very fast, I had a pretty fast single tongue back then, but I tried to single tongue. Got tired really quickly doing that. I could do it longer when I was young, but you get really tired trying to single tongue everything. Slurring didn't work either. Kind of can't get the forward motion going, so quite unconsciously, also, so if I'm doing it on one note, kind of tongue is arched between the teeth. Literally, as Clark Terry would say, stick a valve in front of each of the and think of daddle-deedle-daddle-doodle. That's kind of what your tongue is doing. Daddle-deedle-daddle-doodle. When I do it, it sounds like Fiddler on the Roof. When he does it, it would sound good. So that just kind of got ingrained without thinking about it when I play. And as a result, I'm able to play kind of fast tempos, and it sounds like I'm articulating everything, which I am utilizing that. So it's just something to kind of tuck away in the back of your brain, along with swinging the eighth notes. And also, this was something early on. Dad also had some Charlie Parker records, 10-inch, the original 10-inch, some 78s too. But I got interested in him because there was a picture of a guy with an alto on the cover with a bird on his head. As an 8 or 9-year-old, I thought that was kind of cute looking. But with Charlie Parker, when he played, he also gave certain, I guess the word would be velocity, or just more push to certain notes of the phrases. The trumpet players also did, but maybe not as evident. So rather than playing everything evenly, he would generally higher notes of the phrase. And that also kind of gave music kind of, I don't know, an extra dimension. So it's another kind of a thing to think about when you improvise. And these are all things that I was kind of doing unconsciously when I started to play. And I pretty assiduously, after my classical studies, would put on records. And I'd do that every day. What I was also doing was training my ear just to be able to hear things. I would listen to the bass, try to figure out, listen from the bottom up. Eventually, I started sitting at the piano. By then, it's probably another 5 or 6 years. I stayed with Mr. Herring for until I was about 14. Then I met a great trumpet player in Philly named Evan Solot, who in turn introduced me to a wonderful classical trumpet player named Tony Marcione, whose son Nick is now in New York, first call, all-around trumpet player. And Tony was not an improviser, but he went to school with all the jazz guys at a place called Mastbaum Technical High School, which is where Coltrane, the Heath brothers, Bobby Timmons, McCoy Tyner. It was an amazing place. All these guys studied together with themselves at various people's houses. Benny Golson, imagine that, Benny Golson, Jimmy Heath, and John Coltrane. They all grew up together. Ray Bryant, I'm leaving out a whole bunch of names. A lot of brother, Kenny Barron, Bill Barron. And these guys all grew up together, just asking each other questions. There was pre-jazz ed, so they all learned how to play from just jamming at people's houses. Kind of got off the track what I was thinking about. Oh, so I met Tony and Evan was a big transcriber. So by the time I was 15, I still had not a clue really as to what I was doing, but I was playing pretty advanced stuff for a 15-year-old. I remember that summer I went out to Indiana University where I met Marvin, who's sitting over there, the great Marvin Stamm, and I played in a thing called the Headband, which was led by John Laporta, and was all no music, just he would point to people, tell notes, give out notes, and we'd all improvise and jam up things. And he took me aside and asked me what kind of scales I was playing. I had no idea at that point. So after I met Evan and Tony, I started to transcribe solos. That really helped with my development as far as internalizing a lot of different phrases. I also started, like I mentioned, picking out things on the piano, and also starting, and once again, I was a little older with ballads. Bill Evans, My Foolish Heart. I started with Thelonious Monk, who had more open voicings to try to decipher the jazz language from a harmonic standpoint, and then pick around and see what scales went with what notes, and got a little facility on the piano, just slowly but surely, and just by sitting there, and Dad helped a little, but really not much. It was just mostly from transcribing voicings. Later I studied with Richie Byrack in New York, and Dave Baker at Indiana University, and he helped kind of codify what I was doing. I was playing, which is an altered dominant scale, whole tone, half tone scale, stuff that I was doing, but I didn't know how it related to the chords. David really helped with that, and we really studied Monk for a couple years. He would, I'd learn all the Monk tunes. A lot of them I had learned by picking them out on the piano. They were kind of easy to decipher. So that when I got to Indiana University, that was very formative years for adding on to my harmonic knowledge. Also there I studied with Bill Adam, who was a wonderful teacher. I wanted to recommend a book that just, I think it hasn't been out that long, by Charlie Davis, a great trumpet player who was an Adam student, who lives in L.A., who finally, I don't know why somebody didn't do this before. Adam had what developed into an Adam routine. I won't go into the whole thing, from various books having to do with expanding intervals and long tones, expanding the intervals, starting but holding the notes. Exercises from Schlossberg and Clark. It's called A Tribute to William Adam, and finally Charlie put all the exercises in one book, along with various interpretations, kind of altered things by the Jerry Hay. They went to school together, and Larry Hall with Adam. So I heartily recommend that book. It's really great. I've been utilizing it every day. It's really fun. It has a great biography of Mr. Adam, and he was ahead of his time in a way. He was a very positive thinker, and this book is filled with anecdotes and all the exercises. It's just great, and having all the various things in one book is just a godsend, because you always had to go from one book to another and follow the instructions. Okay, this book, page 97, this is all great in order. I think it's only been out a couple months, so he's not paying me to say this, but I'd really get that book. Go to charliedavis.com. Anyway, I was kind of getting ahead of myself. But I went to IU when I was 15, met Marvin, met this great Stan Kenton band, Cannonball Adderley, quintet was there, Donald Byrd, met other guys my age like Dave Sanborn was there that summer, Lou Marini, Don Grolnick. And at that age, 15, we got together with guys that we liked to play with, formed bands. I was there for 2 weeks, and found relationships that we still have, you know. So really, now's the time to kind of, besides your studies, to seek out other musicians and form groups. Was kind of later in life that I started to apply everything I learned and started to write music. That's a whole other can of worms, so to speak. But it also should be hopefully a part of your development. So went to Indiana University. We had a great band in 1965. We won the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, and we were awarded a State Department tour. I was given a Trumpet Award by Clark Terry, who remained a lifelong friend. And we went on a State Department tour. It was kind of a perk of that festival. The 4-month tour of the Middle East and Asia with a great band. It was a great playing band led by Jerry Coker. and Whit Seidner, who eventually just retired from the University of Miami. And after that, I moved to New York. I decided to give it a shot and studied with Ray Crisara, a great trumpet player. Went to NYU for a semester or so, a little more, but slowly there was a lot of work in New York then, as Marvin can attest to, and I slowly got, for lack of a better word, I guess you'd say, sucked into the music scene, playing with Clark's band, with Marvin, Duke Pearson's band. We did a lot of great things together. So that's, in a nutshell, it's kind of circuitous talk, but that's how I ended up in New York. But the main thing was, from Philly, I was exposed to a lot of different styles of music. That's what I was trying to say in a crazy way. Not only, just a lot of different styles. So by the time I got to New York, I was pretty well versed in different styles of music, and I enjoyed listening to different styles of music. In Philly, there was a great R&B radio station. I was lucky when I went to IU. Booker T of Booker T and the MGs was at school studying music composition, played trombone in the band, so I ended up playing my first year and a half at IU. He would do little gigs around the school all the time, so I kind of got versed in that R&B Southern Stax tradition. I wasn't familiar with that straight from the source. I always forget that he was there. It's a pretty amazing little thing. So by the time I got to New York, I was pretty well versed in a lot of different styles of music. I could kind of get away with playing. If I had a 16-bar classical solo, I could kind of get away with it. Was familiar with blues, and from Philly was a great blues town, and of course bebop from growing up with it. So I was pretty diverse in my interests, and that, I think, really helped me get work, so people ask. And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed playing in a lot of different circumstances. Also kind of, I guess, grew up with the Beatles and the whole revolution of rock and roll becoming more artistic, so that was a part of my thing too. And I've been in New York, or the New York area, ever since. That's really it. I did a lot of studio work and live playing. Eventually started to write my own music, and that was a little later on, but I wanted to kind of forge my own identity as a writer, and started a band, which became well known with my brother. That was later on, but it was a slow, continual development. The trumpet was at the center of everything, but we were kind of so busy in the studios playing all day. When I would get home, I didn't want to practice, so I'd sit at the piano and still figuring out voicings and just write stuff down, and that eventually became songs that we eventually recorded. Going back to sit with Sanborn, who I met when I was 15, the original band, Brecker Brothers band, Don Grolnick, who I also met when I was 15 at the band camp. So now's the time, now's the time to forge those relationships. So that's the biography in a nutshell. How are we doing? Okay. Now, quickly, what I practice, and then hopefully you guys will have some questions. And I'll do some playing. Oh, one thing I usually talk about that I left out. Okay, let me talk about this for a sec. David also everything had names back then, I guess still does. You put a name to something. He had a thing called the Intervallic Approach, David Baker, and he grew out of the George Russell book, which went into modes and melodic minor modes, major modes. But I studied to improvise utilizing motifs from the melodies. So it wasn't just play the melody and then play a bunch of licks. He'd instruct me he'd give me a tune a week. I'd go into Indianapolis from Bloomington. It was before he was teaching there. And usually he'd give me a tune, and I had to analyze the tune intervallically. And when we would improvise, I'd have to use the intervals of the tune. It was really just play compositionally. He called it the intervallic approach. If there was a lot of triplets in the melody, I'd have to play with a lot of triplets. So I always try to think compositionally when I improvise, try to relate to the melody. I always usually play like a tune for, let me just play a few choruses. Going back to Doodle Tongue and all the stuff earlier, but usually demonstrate by playing a pretty simple tune, but it's called Sunny Moon for Two, which this is true, when I first moved to New York, I lived very close to the Village Vanguard, and one of my heroes was Sonny Rollins, so I scampered down there. I'll never forget this, and I walked in and he was playing a blues, but inside of a couple choruses, I knew what the tune was. He was playing Sunny Moon for Two. Most guys, when they play the blues, they play the melody and then they go off. You have no idea what the melody is. So I just want to play a few choruses of Sunny Moon for Two, which features a minor pentatonic, kind of that mode, and just a lick. And I'll just try to improvise a few choruses, just utilizing those two things. So the melody is Doodle Tongue there. That's all kind of, thanks. Just off the two licks. Easier to do with a rhythm section. Get out of breath here. So, I'm pretty high up too right now. I've forgotten. Okay. Got to get used to that. Okay, so what do I practice in a nutshell? And I want to leave the floor open for some questions, so I don't just do my usual shtick, so to speak. But I still spend a certain amount of time warming up, utilizing still Mr. Adams, mostly Mr. Adams stuff. This book is really great help. I mean, I just can't tell you. Also, utilizing Carmine Caruso sometimes, not only warming up, but also took lessons. He really helped with my chops and flexibility. So I'd recommend his calisthenics book. A lot of the trumpet players, Marvin will say, everybody when I came to New York studied with Carmine, and he was a violinist and an alto, I think, right? Alto saxophone. But he was on to something. His main thing had to do with timing, tapping your foot, internal timing, which is with me to this day when I play. I mean, I'm playing with a rhythm section, but I have a certain sense of internal time that came from really listening to him saying, tap your foot, think of 16th note ahead, And timing was his main thing because we use all these muscles and they all have to be kind of used in tandem. So that's another guy to think about and check out his book. That's a whole other hour discussion. But before I play, I usually spend I did it in the room today, maybe not as long as I should have, but a good 20 minutes, maybe a half hour till I feel like I have some blood on my chops and sometimes I'll put the horn up. It just feels like, man, I can't play at all. It might take longer. It depends what's going on the night before. If I got a lot of sleep, there's a lot of other determining factors. So that's number one. Number two, I still like, although I'm certainly not a level of, I'm sure a lot of classical, for lack of a better word, trumpet player, I still like playing out of those books. It just helps my sound. And I'll just pick stuff to play from the usual litany of books that we all know. And it's just fun for me. Going back to, I still play occasionally out of Mr. Herring's books. It just helps my sound. I'm coming kind of out of that tradition. And I'm not even sure I really have strictly, a jazz sound per se. It's more kind of open, from my, I guess, classical studies that people seem to like, and studying with Mr. Mr. Adam. Let me get the water. So I spend a certain amount of time. This is really off and on. I don't really have a prescribed. I could try to get the more clinical stuff out of the way earlier. I find if I don't really get to the warm-ups, at least maybe not first thing in the morning, a kind of bad habit going to the computer first, but I try to get the more clinical stuff out of the way first. And as the day, Mr. Adams said this over, I try not to over-practice, always rest as much as I can when I get the slightest bit tired. But slowly what I do is work my way, because this is what I spend most of my time doing these days, spend a certain amount of time just trying to read music, just to refresh myself, because I don't do as much as that I used to. But I spend a lot of time still writing, trying to, the main part as it gets later on in the evening, expanding my jazz vocabulary, so to speak, either by still transcribing something that I like, I don't do it as much, or learning other people's solos. It's still a great way to expand. Even this is the one avenue where stealing is okay, because the more you steal, and you're not going to sound exactly like the person you steal it from. And I try to concentrate not on one particular person or another, even some other instruments, as far as practicing other people's solos. For instance, Hank Mobley lends a lot of his solos lend themselves to the trumpet. So I try to spread my art of theft to hard to determine who I'm stealing from. And it all comes around because once you internalize it and externalize it, it comes out in a different way. I always bring up somebody like Faddis, a good friend of ours, who concentrated on Dizzy. Probably sounded more like Dizzy than anyone else, but even then, you can kind of separate when it's Faddis or when it's Dizzy. So everyone, as a trumpet player, we all have our own voice. It's just a question of eventually finding it, and you do that by just experimenting a lot, and also kind of off on a tangent here, but recording back in the day, recorded everything. I don't so much anymore. Back when cassettes came out, we recorded all the rehearsals, everything. There was a million cassettes floating around. So that was now it's a lot easier to record yourself and just try to pick apart what kind of separates you from everyone else. But I, like everyone, I've stolen from the best of them. There's a KD lick, Kenny Durham, or you've heard me play this one many times. Something to that effect, Woody Shaw. So it all kind of eventually blends itself into something else. But it all starts out, I remember, I was pretty close with Woody. I met him when we were both 19. He was playing with Horace Silver and eventually recommended me for the band. And eventually, his first book of transcriptions came out years later, and I bought the book and I learned a lot of the solos, and I was all excited. I played a bunch of stuff for my brother. We were at a rehearsal, and I played a bunch of stuff for him, and he said, "You know, you sound like watered down Woody." So I kind of thought, well, maybe I better get away from that and get back into my usual routine. Another thing that was interesting too, now that I talk about it, you gotta be careful what you internalize. I was doing a tour a few years ago with Faddis, Lou Soloff, and Terrell Stafford, and it was generally called a tribute to Louis Armstrong, which I hadn't listened. Of course, I had listened to him, but I hadn't internalized a lot of his stuff. So before the tour started, I started kind of listening to a lot of Louis and playing along with Louis records. And I got to the point where I could do a pretty good imitation. It was perfect for this trip because we were playing modern stuff, but it was all, the theme of the tour was Louis Armstrong. But I found after the tour was over, I was going back to my usual gigs, and all of a sudden I'd be playing and some Louis would just pop out of my horn when I wasn't expecting it. So you got to really be careful with this stuff in a way, because it was kind of just an interesting thing. Because whatever you internalize eventually comes out. And also another thing that I do, and as did my brother and Tim Hagen's come to mind, Tommy Harrell, is just play. Whatever that was, or whatever that was. So just try to play intervallically and record things. Every once in a while something will come out that wasn't too great, but something will come out that will work its way into being a tune. That was just something that I played a few weeks ago. I mean, I changed it around a little, but that ended up being on a tune called the Philly Flash that we recorded a few months ago with my late great friend, he just passed away, Larry Coryell. But that was just a line like that. Now I can never remember it when I have to, but what I just played. That always happens too. But that just started out as a line. I kind of recorded it and then changed a little and then figured out some chords that fit under it. And that's a way just to expand, you know, to keep it interesting, try to think of new things to play. Along with, and that usually happens later at night. I don't know, I discovered when I was just like what just happens now, when I'm sitting there thinking I got to think of something new and really think about trying to play something, I can't do it. But when later in the evening when I'm more relaxed, I've said this before, have the TV on, just playing along with commercials and it's going to be it's late at night, play with records for a while, watch TV, play with another, Jamie Aebersold. Generally, it's easier for me to think of things, different things, newer things as it gets on. So that's a whole other discussion, finding time of the day where you can kind of be more creative. So I spend a lot of time, probably the bulk of my later time with the horn, and this is pretty much when I'm home every night. That's the last thing I do. I'll play off and on for a couple hours with play-along records or set up a little thing on a keyboard and just play. So I'll get to the point where I can, it's another kind of endurance being a so-called jazz player where you have the horn up. It's not like in an orchestra where you play a few bars and rest. It's another kind of endurance, and the only way to do it is to slowly kind of build it up every night. So I, kind of gauge how many days I have between gigs and slowly build up to the point where I think I'm ready to do the gig. So it's really a daily process, off and on. I don't set up, I don't have like an hour or two I practice. It's just, and it's a little different every day. But I try to, the one thing that's for sure, before I go to sleep, I'll have played at least 2 or 3 hours during the day, and particularly before I go to sleep. I would just always have the horn in my hand. I rarely ever watch TV or do anything without having the horn pretty close so I can just pick it up and play it. And that's kind of, see if I left anything else, in a nutshell, my kind of crazy routine, or lack of it's really lack of a routine. The only thing that's probably routine is doing long tones to warm up of various form or another. And even that changes a little. I just get bored doing the strict Adam routine every day, and this book really helps because there's so many different similar exercises to choose from, the Charlie Davis book. So, how are we doing? Okay, questions. I kind of ran through a lot of stuff really quick. Maybe I shouldn't talk so much, but go ahead.
Have you ever ran into people like performances trying to mimic your solos, and you had to develop it actually you stole from someone else?
Well, yeah, I mean that's happened. There was one guy in particular in Boston. I wish I remember his name, who would sound a lot like me. I'd run into him on gigs, and I don't even forget where. But yeah, what goes around comes around, and there's just a connection between all of us, because we all start out stealing from each other too. Friends, guys that I've grown up with. So yeah, that has happened. It's kind of ironic, but true. Just like I said, you got to start somewhere, and for me, that was the way, is just to mimic other people's solos. And I never could quite sound like anyone else. I always had kind of like a little thing different in my sound or something. So, but I stole from the best of them. I still do. Yeah, somebody, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions, but starting at the very, very beginning, like your first 10 seconds. I assume you're playing the lead pipe, Bill Adam, right?
Yeah.
Do you play the mouthpiece too?
Or
no?
Well, I play the lead pipe. I do that. I can't say I do it every day, but I do some buzzing some days. Yeah. Right hand, not use the pressure, and also, there's another good thing. Well, there's two things. One of the little, I'm not a big, I don't use gadgets too much, but I have to say Arturo's Sando valve is really good. I always have it like in the room. He grew up in Cuba, and when I was on the road with him with the GRP big band, he had this wood thing he made. It was handmade, and he always had the thing in his hand now on sandovalve.com. And he's not paying me to say that, but he just has a plastic replica of the valves and a tube that you can adjust the resistance and just get your air going and your airstream. So I do utilize that. It's really seemed to help. It also is a warm-upper if I'm in a hotel room. So that's always out, and it's also really helped my fingers by utilizing it.
You have a quick question on equipment. It looks like an old Megaton. And
This is a 2.5C that I've been trying, because this is really an old horn, a good one. It's a Yamaha 8335G that was made in Tokyo when they first started doing Xenos. And this is an older 2.5C Megatone that's got a couple nicks in the rim. So it just goes to show you, I must have 12 new 2.5Cs from various places. I got a friend in Philly that always is sending me, what's the website where they sell things? And they're all still completely different. So when I'm in a kind of pressure situation, I always end up going back to this one. Yeah.
So as of now, who are some people that you're listening to?
Can't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, as of right now, who are some people that you are listening to?
Oh, well, that's a good one. Well, a guy that, I'll tell you 3 guys that come to mind. I was just thinking of them before. Number one is Marquise Hill from Chicago, who's kind of synthesized a lot of stuff in his group, which I know is still together, called the Black Tet. I was a judge at the not Notre Dame, it was a few years, at the Thelonious Monk Institute, it's probably about 3 years ago now, and he won the trumpet prize. He's just a great, completely original. You can tell him in a second when he plays. He's got his own kind of sound, own way of approaching things. Also is a pretty well-versed composer, and this group, the Black Tent, is just fantastic from Chicago. He's also playing with Marcus Miller. He comes to mind. The second place winner, who I just happened upon on YouTube, is a guy named Billy Buss, or B-U-S-S. Also, not as well known as Marquise, I think, will be with his records. He has a new record out on Concord, is getting his, and plus playing with Marcus is getting the name out there. Billy was also second place, very good trumpet player, young guy. Third place was Adam, oh boy, wait a minute. His father and grandfather are great composers. I'll think of it in a second. I'm terrible when I start thinking of names. Wait a minute. Can't, but great. There's scads of young guys. Those come to mind. Good friend of mine is Alexander Sipiagin, Russian trumpet player. You might check him out. Just had really good classical training. Also has his own vocabulary, so to speak. And of course, guys my age. There's a lot of guys, and Marvin still was a big influence on me coming up. And we're going to play together tonight. Yeah.
How do you go from playing within the changes to start learning to bend them and kind of get a little bit out there, be able to manipulate that and still maintain?
Well, that's a good question, and the way I describe it, I think my brother the same way. I mean, we get to the piano, and there's a certain amount of tension with notes that are outside the scale. So it's just kind of creating tension with wrong notes, basically. In fact, this is an interesting thing. I just got back from a jazz cruise in February. Marcus Miller was on the cruise with Marquise Hill, great band. And Marcus, they were playing Jean-Pierre, you know. That tune. And Marcus had Alex Hahn, the altoist, play the solo, kind of like what I just did, utilizing all the right notes, supposed right notes in the scale. And then he had him play a solo utilizing all the wrong notes, stuff not in the scale, just to show the audience the difference. And there's the best way to describe it, I like to play kind of inside and outside is like tension and release, really. And I'll play things that I can't, I couldn't tell you what it was, what the relationship is. It's a spontaneous thing, but I know how it's going to sound. I know it's going to be an on purpose wrong note that I'll resolve eventually, if that helps. But it's not really a science to it. It's just kind of knowing the theory and knowing the scales and knowing how to get inside and outside the scales without getting too far out. I mean, there are wrong notes if you kind of lay on something that's really wrong, but it's a question of really tension and release. And it was really an interesting thing when I have to remember that one. It was for the audience, just to show that exact thing. If I had a piano player here, I could probably try and do it. And I haven't ever but it was really interesting and it's a good question. It's something to think about, because that's what kind of makes music. You want that tension, and every once in a while you want a wrong note on purpose, you know, so you can resolve it. You don't want everything just to stay inside the way it's supposed to be. You want to take some chances. Yeah, okay, how about
what do you do when you get a new set of changes or a new tune?
Well, when I get a new set of changes, or if it's something hard, I'll do the same thing my brother did, go to a piano and write out the scales if I have to. All right, and you know, sometimes even just write out the notes or write out 3 or 4 notes that I want to kind of lay on. If I get really involved, maybe write out the number 1 scale or number 2 scale that I want to try to utilize. And then it's just a question of sometimes I'll go try to play the changes on the piano as good as I can. Adam O'Farrell, by the way, Arturo O'Farrell, that's the 3rd drum player, just a great young kid, great player. And I'll play the changes on the piano and just practice playing them over and over. Sometimes it's almost like learning a classical etude sometimes, if it's really hard changes where you're really kind of locked into certain things. It's just a question of getting the thing in your ear so that you can negotiate this stuff. And sometimes it takes a while, but I'm not afraid to write it down on the paper. Well,
So once you learn them on the piano, how do you handle just mentally transferring it to the trumpet since it's in a different key?
Oh, to the different key?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good one. It's just some guys, for instance, Joe Henderson, utilize that. You only wanted concert changes whenever you had to know. A lot of guys don't like looking at B-flat changes because it is kind of confusing. But I've just gotten used to the good thing about playing the piano is you can close your eyes and in a split second kind of, you know, see the chords. I still play. I left that out. I still play a lot of piano during the day too, and at night. It just trying to find voicings. It just kind of helps my whole process in between playing the trumpet. And the writing is more on a keyboard, but I have an acoustic piano. I just still like playing the sound of it. Just helps my whole overall thing. But it's the split-second thing. You kind of picture the thing in the chord in your head that you're thinking of, and then you do have to like, oh yes, step down. It's this little process that is somewhat confusing, but it just helps if you can get a mental picture of the shape of the chord on the piano. And it just, playing piano does help a lot. Yeah, okay, you're patient.
I was wondering if, as you were getting older, even now, like whether you're changing your routine in the morning, or like whether there's any physical limitations, and how do you get over that? Because not many people get to this age and still able to play very well.
Well, you just have to. The question was, how do I get, as I'm getting older, which that's a good observation. How do I keep this thing going? And it, you know, you just have to kind of play correctly and just not overdo it. If anything that I've noticed, it takes just a little longer. I can't recuperate like I used to. You know, if I did the things I did when I was younger, I'd be probably just in bed right now. But I just have to start easy, make sure I warm up before I play, and know not when to overdo it. I've been caught a couple times, so recently, not that much, but remember just a month ago I was in LA and I did some playing more than I thought I would the day before. Then I had a concert. My chops kind of got swollen. We had a long rehearsal during the day. It felt okay. And during the gig, it was tough. So sometimes you just get caught. It's a trumpet, you know. It's always a daily, not battle, but it's kind of a, you know, give and take battle, so as Dizzy would say. Just got to put in the time. Yeah.
So if someone who has like a pretty busy schedule, how do you go about, I guess, either warming down, or what do you do to make sure that fatigue just doesn't build over time to the point where it affects like the next day?
Well, sometimes you just get caught, but I just try to get a good, you know, the best thing is just get a good night's sleep. If you really feel like take 2 aspirins, it supposedly works, and I don't warm down that much really, but maybe if after the gig I'll just play some low notes, long tones really softly, and that seems to help. But the main thing I've noticed, if I get a pretty good night's sleep, it helps immeasurably. If I don't, it can be in trouble. Yeah, okay.
You believe in pedal tones? Do you play pedals?
Well, I do. I'm not that great at it, but I do. I don't do it assiduously, but yeah, I'll get down. For some reason, I can play pedal C with a, you know, you're supposed to do it open. I can do it 1, 2, 3, and I can do it with a mute in. But it seems I don't overdo it because what people always said was that it would affect your sound, but it helps my endurance, I think. It tightens up my chops by doing it. Anything else? We got a couple more minutes. Oh, about one more. Go ahead.
What are some pretty common mistakes you see people making?
Sorry, I didn't
What
quite.
are some pretty common mistakes that you see people making when they're trying to get?
Well, and this was probably guilty of this, just not using their air. I think that was my, always, especially when I was improvising. I think utilizing your air correctly and just keeping the airstream going, focused, taking a good breath, I think that's number one in this game of trumpet playing. And overblowing is another thing I try to avoid. It happens when I get nervous, and I try to practice softly. It's a strange thing, you know. It's another. Just was talking with Marvin earlier about recording. I have a little setup at home. We do a lot of Pro Tools recording, and it never fails. It's how long have I been doing this? And I'll be warming up, and I'll be playing into the mic. My wife is very good at engineer, and I sound fine. As soon as she presses the record button, the meter goes zoom. I've been doing this for 50 years, you know, how long? 50, 60 years. As soon as the record button goes on, I start to overblow. So I have to stop and say, okay, just pretend it's not on, you just sounded good. So it's those two things, utilizing your air and not overblowing, I think, are two important things to kind of always keep in mind. Okay, Marvin.
Just as a practical thing for
Yeah.
a lot of these people here, they know you as a soloist. Many of them, if you're jazz players, are trying to develop as a soloist or a lead player. You've always been one of the people who remembered working with the guys in New York who loved the fact that you were a magnificent section player. And I don't think that many people think about that today. And can you speak a little bit to that and the importance of that?
Well, it is really important, and I miss playing in big bands, but because I wasn't strictly a lead player, and this goes back probably to the Indiana University band, because we played every day. I generally played second trumpet, third, sometimes where the solos were. It's a question of really trying to help the lead player and not, once again, not overblowing, trying to match the lead player in sound and also little nuances in the playing. So when to cut off, when to use vibrato, when not to use vibrato. And of course there's give and take, but it's more giving when you're in the section and following the lead player, who in turn follows the other lead players in the band. And it's so important. It just takes one guy in the section to screw everything up. And I'm sure Marvin has the same experiences. This happened so many times, and somewhat recently. I won't mention the name. Good soloist, but in a section, boy, just overblown, just not listening to anybody else. So it's really important, if you want to work a lot, to be able to do something like that. Okay, one more.
How do you go back and forth between the cerebral side of jazz and the oral side? Because when I'm soloing, sometimes I struggle with, okay, I'm thinking about every place I'm landing, but how do you shut that off? How do you go from, okay, I need to land here to keep ideas going? Does that make sense?
Well, it's more inside. Well, in general, I think you have to kind of pace yourself. If that's, I'm a little more conscious of that, especially if I'm relaxed and pacing myself for the whole night. I don't try to just let it all hang out, so to speak, on the first couple tunes. But when I'm soloing, like from solo to solo, it's hard to explain. You're like in three places at once. You have to keep your, know where you are in the tune, but you have to not repeat yourself, so you want to think about where you've been, and you have to think ahead to know where you're going. And there's no really easy answer to that. It's kind of similar to the thing you'd asked before, the tension and release, where there's not really a science to it. But I was always taught, and it's a good thing I play trumpet too, but by Horace Silver, to not, number one, not overplay, and not to overplay, not to play too long. I'm a firm believer in that, although, you know, as saxophonists, growing up with my brother, there's a whole other train of thought of saxophones. But I generally like solos that, Horace, I remember, always would be over my shoulder if I played too long, or if he's listening to somebody poke me and say, see, he just repeated himself. So I'm always conscious about trying not to repeat myself and to make a statement and not overplay. I don't know if that really answers it, but it's a challenge. What can I say? It's just a daily thing. It's a love-hate relationship, but you know, I love the sound of the trumpet. There's nothing better. This is the number one instrument. We're all in the same boat, but you know, you have to love the sound, and I do. I mean, I still love, there's nothing better than the sound of the trumpet, so we're all lucky. We play this thing, constant challenge. You know, I remember when I was young, I thought I'd just grow up and be able to play. Little did I know when I was 10 years old, I'd still be 71 years old, still trying to figure this thing out. But it's a lot of fun along the route, so we're all lucky. And any more questions? We're kind of just try to stick to the schedule. I'll be around for a couple days, so if you guys want to pull my coattails, let me know. Thanks for having me. Thanks.